Hello, and welcome to Two Black Church Boys Churched in Change. My name is Calvin Bell III, and I am here with my co-host, William Lee. How you doing, William?
I'm good, man. As you guys noticed, tonight we are together and we are in the church. We're practicing social distancing, even though it doesn't look like we're practicing social distancing right this second. But we assure you that we have been practicing social distancing since we've been here. We've been wearing our masks, our gloves. Everything here is all good and sanitized. We thank you all for tuning in with us again tonight. We last left you 2 weeks ago talking and debating, perhaps intensely at times, about the forms of protest and whether or not violence has a place in protest. And at the end of that discussion last week, we said that we were going to move from discussing protests to discussing other ways that people are on the ground working to dismantle white supremacy. And tonight we are so honored and blessed to have with us two amazing people who are doing some great work in education, working to dismantle white supremacy and white privilege. One of them is no stranger to us, and by the time tonight is over, the other person who some of you may not know, you will be very well pleased and well familiar with his work. So without further ado, we're going to allow them to introduce themselves. We're going to start with Mr. Carter, and then we'll go to our own Nadiera Young.
How you guys doing? I'm Joseph Carter, Vice Principal at a school in Southeast DC.
Nadiera Young. I am a language arts teacher in Baltimore, Maryland.
They're being very modest in their introductions. I didn't want to have to pump them up, but between the two of them, they have more than 20 years of educational expertise and experience, particularly working with vulnerable and at-risk communities, working and educating our children to be global citizens and to be socially conscious and socially aware. And so that's why we decided to have them as our guests, because we are very familiar with their work. And so the first question I want to pose tonight, I'm going to ask this to, I guess we'll start with Nadiera, and then we'll ask Joseph the same question, is what role do you see as an educator in dismantling white supremacy?
Well, I think as an educator, that's like one of the main roles, because in everything that you do as an educator, you should be dismantling white supremacy. So I would say, in addition to helping students learn empathy, in addition to helping students be global citizens, in addition to helping them with their studies and helping them understand how to think, not necessarily what to think, but how to think, I think it's our job to dismantle white supremacy, because those are the things that will stop their growth and stop the growth of all children, even white children. So I think that dismantling white supremacy, or race, or educating students in a like a radical way, radical education, justice, reconciliation, all those things are tied into our jobs as teachers, whether we know it or not, whether we understand it. It is our job to dismantle the hardships or the inequalities or the inequities that our students may face, whether it's in our classrooms or outside in the world.
Right.
And same question to you, Joe.
So a couple of things. So as Frederick Douglass once said, education is that education is emancipation. And so truly holding the keys to emancipating our kids comes through education. And as a leader in DC once reminded me that education and liberating our children is really 3-generational work. When a student obtains liberation through education, that student is now able to provide a better life for themselves. Their parents are then able to have a better life. Their children are then able to have a better life. And so by educating our children, we're giving them a chance to truly be liberated, to truly make an impact in their community, to truly achieve the aims of social justice, to truly show that Black lives always matter, to truly show that they are free. And that's what dismantling white supremacy is about.
Right. And in that same sphere, really, I was just wondering what it would look like and what's education going to look like, especially during this period of COVID-19. So we're not only living in a period of heightened racism, but also in a pandemic. And so what is education going to look like for the both of you in terms of going back and really helping your students reacclimate themselves to school and education, because we've been online for months on months so far?
I could start. So, I mean, if we're going to be honest, we were in a pandemic before the pandemic, right? So education has always been inequitable for Black children in this country. So I think what the most key thing that we can do is to provide our students a strong sense of identity, to provide our students with a sense of familiarity and as much normalcy in a digital schedule as possible, to constantly surround them with images of Black and brown people who are high achieving, and also to be very candid about the reality of what's going on in the world that we face and the events that are currently happening around us. And I think if we do those key things, then we can provide that sense of stability and structure that our kids need to come back to school after being out from COVID-19.
I would agree with all of that. And I think this pandemic has exposed even more the inequities in education, right? So for Baltimore, the rest of the school budget went to buying laptops for students. And then we have students who are like, you know, Comcast is one of the biggest companies for Baltimore in terms of internet. And I don't even understand why you're still paying for internet if you're a K through 12 student. I think that's asinine. Like, that should be free. You're a student. And so we're seeing like students who don't have access. And this pandemic, if nothing else, has exposed the inequities and the things that educators or administration has tried to just pass over and say, well, when they're in school, they can access this. But it's like, what happens when they go home? You know, for instance, there's a school here in Baltimore, not my school, but a student like had their computer plugged in, because if you go close enough to the school building, you can, you know, use the Wi-Fi. And he had his computer plugged in, and it's in a white area. And so predominantly Black school, almost all Black. And, you know, the cops were called. So then the principal called a liaison to the school, and she goes up and she's like, hey, what's going on? What are you doing here? He's like, I'm a senior. I have to get my work done. I don't have internet. This is the only place, you know, this is the only safe place that I think I can be. And even in that, there's still inequities because the police were still called, you know, so it's just like this pandemic, if we as a school, as an education system, citywide, statewide, but nationwide, if we do not change, if this does not light the fire under us, I'm not sure what will, because this has been happening for years, decades, centuries, and now it is in everyone's faces, not just ours or not just a certain demographic, it's in everyone's faces. And so this is a perfect opportunity to decide that every child K through 12 will have internet no matter what. Whatever household you're in, you get internet no matter what. Every child will have a device K through 12 no matter what for free. There is no price or anything attached to that. So that when you have online classes, so when there's a snow day, you have your device. Anything that happens, you now have a device and you can access it in your home. And I say every child because it's not, I don't want it to seem like, oh, I have to share a laptop with my sibling. Every child individually should have access to those things.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm going to cut you off, yeah.
Oh no, I agree wholeheartedly. It's really exposed the inequities, even looking in the same city. When I look at schools in Southeast DC versus other parts of DC, and how those students have access, and we have students who are still struggling to gain access, and that has to be addressed before we can move forward.
And understanding that cell phones are not the equalizer, because that was a big talk where it was like, the kid has a phone, they can just do your Google Classroom on the phone, and then the kid's like, I submitted it, and I'm like, I didn't get it. This is like the 5th assignment I haven't received. What's going on? And they're like, I don't know. And then you realize that Google Classroom looks different on the computer than on the iPad than on the cell phone. And if you're on a cell phone, it's so much harder. So you're constantly debunking myths that people believe and will just, they have a phone, they should be able to do the work. And it's like, not quite, that's unacceptable. So I think this needs to be the wake-up call. So hopefully something happens or is happening.
I guess part of that is that when we talk about providing each student with technology, providing each student with internet access, let's just delve into that a little bit more. Who is going to be providing each student with internet access? Who's going to be providing each student with laptops or Chromebooks? Because it seems right now that we have placed a lot of this burden, and this is one of the issues that I have, and something that me and Calvin talk about offline, is that we've placed the burden for educating our children, for eradicating poverty, for eradicating homelessness, for eradicating all of these different social ills on our churches, on our civic institutions, on our nonprofits. And that shouldn't be the case. As taxpaying citizens, in my opinion, the onus should be on our institutions to provide those type of services. So for instance, I know in Southeast DC, Alfred Street Baptist Church provided Chromebooks for an entire school. That's an amazing feat. Here in Camden, Little Rock Baptist Church provided Chromebooks for an entire, I want to say Forest Hill. Amazing work, but that shouldn't, in my opinion, fall on the school system. That, I mean, not the school system, excuse me, that shouldn't fall on the church. That should be a function of the tax dollars that we pay and the government providing its citizens with every opportunity possible to gain equal footing. So I'm just wondering, if we're having this conversation, can we speak more to who's going to fund this, or in your opinion, who can fund this, where that money can come from, and how that can be allocated?
I think one thing you have to think about is how schools are funded.
Yeah.
So they're funded by property taxes. So if you live in an economically disadvantaged area where, let's just say on your block, there are 10 homes and 7 of them are abandoned, you're not getting property taxes from those places. You're getting it just from those 3 homes, as opposed to being at another school in a wealthier area where all 10 of your homes are occupied and people are paying taxes. So that's your first issue, is that the way that we fund education is inequitable automatically. So you have to level the playing field, because it's already uneven from the time my kid starts preschool or kindergarten at their local school. And then you have schools you have charter schools, you have school choice, like here in Baltimore. After 5th grade, you don't have to go to your zone school. You can apply and get in a magnet program, get in an academic program at a school an hour away, and go there for school. So I think if we're going to talk about I absolutely agree with you. And I think it's dangerous when we have an independent entity or a group or a person who does not have to be accountable to anyone funding education in the way that the churches have. And I'm not saying, like, I'm so grateful for those places, but let's just say Bill Gates is like, well, I want to give these 5 schools, I want to give all of them laptops. He doesn't have to be accountable to anyone. So if he decides he wants to do something else with the school, and because he has money, he can, that's dangerous. So I absolutely agree that we have to figure out how to give more autonomy to the school, but then also how to figure out how the taxes and what people are paying can contribute to that, and figure out how to hold people accountable. But when the system that we're funneling the money into is already inequitable, we are setting students up to fail automatically.
Yeah, it has to come from a national level. I mean, that's the only way. State funding is proven to be inequitable in many cases. The district funding is inequitable. It has to come from the federal government. That's the only way we can truly level the playing field and make sure that students are getting the resources that they need during this pandemic.
Right. And so moving it back into this area of heightened racism and how education can really help with that, what are schools now going to tell parents? How is that connection going to work between the teachers and educators, and with the parents who are teaching their students one thing, but then the students are coming back with questions, really confronting the issues head on amongst each other, and really debating these topics and really talking about these issues? How do you really make that connection so it doesn't seem like the educators, the teachers, the schools are teaching the students one thing, but then they're going home and learning something totally different?
So you have to look at it as a 3-legged stool, right? You have the students, the parents, and the educators working in tandem. We have to all collaborate together. And while we may not always agree, we can always give each other a different perspective. And what we have to teach our students to do is to think critically. It's not that they're always going to be right. It's not that they're always going to arrive at a basic fact, but if you think critically and open yourself up to different perspectives, it's just giving the students a different way to look at what's going on. And so when you present it that way in a collaborative effort with the parent, you invite the parent into conversations about race. You invite the parent into conversations about inequity. You invite the parent into conversations about Black Lives Matter. And that gives parents a voice and a seat at the table so that it's collaborative. And so I'm not talking to the parent, I'm talking with the parent.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the reality is, if you decide as a parent that this is not what you want to do, or this is not for you, and you are able to go elsewhere, that is also a possibility. I mean, I teach in Baltimore City, but I teach at one of the most affluent schools, public schools, which we get students from all over Baltimore City. So we are in Roland Park. We get students in Roland Park, which is our school, public school. It's a K through 8. It's surrounded by private schools, right? Surrounded by $1 million homes, all of that. But we get a lot of students who get bused in or get driven to school. So we get a wealth of student diversity. But also, like, I'm a Black educator at the school, and I often have been my students' first Black teacher, right? So it doesn't even matter if the whole school is like Black Lives Matter. If Ms. Young says it, then it's like Ms. Young is pushing an agenda. She told my kids Black Lives Matter, even though it's like taped on the school wall. So I absolutely agree that you have to do it in community or with parents. But what we often find, not often, but what we find sometimes at my school is that, you know, our principal has to decide this is what we're doing. And it has to be for staff as well. Because if you think parents don't agree or don't want to do something or don't want their students to learn something,
right? Wait till you see.
Exactly. You can only imagine what some teachers might be thinking. And right now, like our school, we are reading How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. Amazing book. Shout that out. Everybody should read it. But we're really working on the self-work, right? Like what I need to do within myself to be anti-racist, so that when I'm in my classroom, when I'm in the hallway, when I'm in the lunchroom, when I'm just getting to work, I am exhibiting all the things that I should to be anti-racist. Because if I'm not being anti-racist, I'm being racist. And so we're reading it as a staff, and there are hard conversations happening, like hard conversations. And this is the first time that our staff have had created a space for ourselves, right, within our school. So you can only imagine how our students must feel in that building, and the responsibility that we hold as Black teachers to create space for our students and to make sure that our students feel that when they're in an environment where there is no space, that they created for themselves, if we are not there to lift that up. And so I would say, you know, we have gotten a lot more support from parents and a lot more teacher buy-in now. But I do think in order for the stool to work, it has to be in community, right? Because ultimately, I exactly what you said, teach the children to think critically, so that even if they do go home and they're getting different ideas and different values there, that they know that if they decide that they want to think something different or they have questions, that in our classrooms, they have the space to ask those questions. They have the space to explore things. Like my first 2 years there, I had students who told me their parents didn't like Black people, like in my classroom. And, you know, I gave them space to share what they needed to share. It was shocking. I was just like, wow, I'm glad you feel comfortable enough to say that to me. And that's what you want. But also, like, you know, you understand that this 6th grader is trying to figure out who you are as a teacher and as a Black person, and then also what's happening in their homes. And there's some dissonance there. Something is not sitting well with them. And so they're trying to figure out, and that's what you want, right? I'm not telling you that you have to love Black people. I will exhibit how to love people as your teacher, and I will love you regardless of what your parents say or do. But I think as long as we in our classrooms give them space to think critically, to ask questions, to explore, then I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, even if all 3 are not on the same page all the time.
And to add to that, and I agree, I think that I saw that firsthand this year. At the school that I work at in Southeast DC, we actually have an all-Black team, the first all-Black team at the school that we're at, to launch a middle school. So it was our first year launching our 6th grade academy. Mm-hmm. And what we really tried to stress to our students was identity and the value of being Black. and being Black and being proud and learning about their history. And when students learned about their history and their rights and where they came from and where we are now and see Black is truly beautiful, I think that it inspires them to then become activists. It inspires them to then go out on the front lines because they know exactly who they are as defined by themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
A wealth of follow-up questions I have. I'm going to try to ask them all and package them in one concise question. But before I do that, I just wanted to say hey to the Facebook audience, hey to the Zoom audience. This is by all means an interactive conversation. We don't want to be talking at you. We want you to engage and participate. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and we will address them as they come in. Also, I see there are some people on Zoom. Hey to the Zoom people as well. But I guess my follow-up question is, we are not only witnessing how this pandemic has laid bare the inequities in our communities in education, health access, community development, all of that, but we're also still witnessing the devaluation of Black life.
Yep.
So Ahmaud Arbery, Nina Pop, Tony McDade,
Breonna Taylor,
yeah. George Floyd,
Yep.
Rashard Brooks, trans lives that we don't even know the names of the people, our trans brothers and sisters, our LGBTQ brothers and sisters,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I said that on this platform, who are being killed by our police officers. And so when I think about all that's going on, I think about how our schools have historically been used as the incubator for Black protests. When we think about Ruby Bridges and the integration movement, when we think about how our legal battles were first fought by integrating our public schools, when we think about the sit-ins and the drive-downs and March for Our Lives and how all of these movements got started in our schools,
Mm-hmm.
the question that I have for you is, how do you feel as though education is preparing our students for protests? And Nadiera, I guess I'll ask you this first, because I've noticed in particular, you're very active in getting your students engaged in protests and on the front lines. So I'm very curious as how do you move kids out of this Black identity and all of this love that we're talking about in the classrooms to actual community engagement and resistance work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's been a little bit harder with the pandemic because I'm not physically there with them. But our school participated in a protest at a huge intersection where our school is. So they did that. And then, on my Google Classroom, for instance, we wrote love letters to Black people, just because I feel like every day I'm looking at just images and things that are trying to tear us down and weigh on us. And so I did that with my students. But before we did that, we had a conversation about George Floyd. And I gave the story, this is who George Floyd was. This is what happened. Just the facts, because I don't need to give you my personal opinions. But, asking them questions, letting them speak to me and tell me exactly what they're feeling. And I'm sure you all have noticed, this is the moment to be Black Lives Matter, pro-Black Lives Matter for any and all people, whether you've ever been pro-Black Lives Matter or not. And so I think it was a little, it's weird to say this, but it was a little easier to get them, to push them to participate in a protest, to do the assignment, to push back on their parents. I had a parent email and she's like, thank you for having this conversation with my kid. I didn't know how to start this conversation, so I'm glad they had it in class. So really it's just having the conversations with them, but then also helping them, asking them, how do these worldly events compare to what you experience in this school building or with your teachers? And they can tell you, this teacher is racist, this teacher did this was a microaggression. So we've given them the tools so that they can identify when they see the injustices, not just for themselves, but for others who may not know it. And then they're able to identify them, and then they're able to decide what they want to do about them. So one thing I don't pressure them to do anything. If they're like, this teacher did this, And I'm like, okay, what do you need me to do? I don't want to do anything. And it's like, okay. And that's their choice. You know, you don't ever pressure students to do anything. You can encourage them and try all you can, but they have to get there in their own time, because that is so much a part of their identity and who they are becoming. But I think the best way that I've been able to get my students to engage in anti-racist work and engage in activism is to help them understand that even if it isn't happening to you right now, it could happen. To see the parallels between the world and between what's happening in our schools, in our school, and then also empathy. So you're not just a global citizen, you're a global empathetic citizen, because you have to be able to understand the pain of others, even if you don't experience it. And you shouldn't have to see that pain to know that there's something wrong. And so I think that's the biggest thing. A lot of my students have been telling me, I actually didn't go to the protest because I had a cough, and I'm not trying to, it's rough out here, y'all. I'm just not trying to, I got asthma, there's a lot going on. But my students went and they sent videos, sent pictures. You know, they're messaging me, engaging in that manner. And so I'm doing my best to share information with them on our classroom, but then also encourage them to use their voice, use your own voice. And like also reminding them that they have a voice. You don't have to speak for the voiceless. You just pass the mic, you just get off the stage, right? And so reminding them that when you have this privilege, you use this privilege to give others space, to make space for others, because you yourself, if you know, because I teach white students, brown students, black students, and some of them are very privileged. And it's like sometimes you just gotta step to the side, but they're still learning and still growing. And right now, I think the best thing is just continuing to engage them and help them understand that, like, you have to decide what side of history you're going to be on. You decide what you're going to do with your voice. You decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. Is that knowledge emancipating you, or is it keeping you stuck somewhere? And if it is keeping you stuck somewhere, then it's not the knowledge that you need. So I think that's what I've been doing, at least during this pandemic. That was a lot, sorry.
Good, it was all good. Lots of nuggets.
I think to add to that, kind of something along the lines of what I heard you say, is that safe space creates the student's capacity to have a voice. And once students know that they have a voice, what you have to get them to understand is not just the juxtaposition between themselves and Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, but they then begin to see themselves as Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, or Floyd. And so that then incites the activism. We've had students that are going out to protest. We've had students who are having conversations with students in younger grades because they have a responsibility to share their voice, to educate, not just through protesting, also through social media, also through other platforms that they have, even having conversations with parents, with other staff members, recognizing white privilege, calling it out, bias. And when you give students those types of tools, that then empowers them to become the activists, to fight the resistance, to be on the front lines in the way that we need them to be.
Do you mind pulling that back up, Calvin? We got a question from the Zoom group. We're also at the 8 o'clock point. We really do try to keep these to a half an hour, but it never works, ever. So we're asking that you give us 15 minutes just to honor this question and then to wrap up. But the question that was asked was, you all have discussed the fact that property taxes dictates the amount of money that a school district has. Would redistricting schools to force affluent areas and poor areas to attend together be a possibility?
I guess that's a possibility, but I think the best way would be federal. That the same thing that you said. I think that Joseph said. I think that's the best way to do it, because there's no red tape. There's red tape because this is America, but there's no, when you're allotting the same amount, or this higher entity is allotting that money, you still have this you still have this group of people that you have to answer to. So if I'm redistricting, it's still, we can still find ourselves in the same predicament. So I think federal would have to be the goal.
Yeah, I agree. It would have to be.
Yeah, and so I have kind of like a two-part question as like more of a wrap up. But For one, as students go back to schools, I know that some of your schools have programs and resources in place to really talk about these issues and really combat them. However, for schools like my own, for example, that I attended a predominantly white private school institution that is not really one-sided in terms of politics, but also students come from different backgrounds, different areas. And really the schools will try to have to create curriculum around this and different things like that. So how do schools really take the steps into creating curriculum that combats or talks about the protests and really talks about things such as why people are looting, what's the symbolism behind that? And different things that students are seeing on TV. And then the second part to that is how do you engage educators into these conversations as well, especially white educators who may have not had to have this conversation with their own children or are learning about it, but really want to take steps into checking their privilege and teaching their students the right way, the right direction. What are the steps that schools can take that don't have those programs and resources in place? So we can start with Joseph and then Nadiera.
Okay, so of course, one way is finding a curriculum that tailors to that. I know this year at the school that I'm at, we had an African American history course for our sixth graders, which was pivotal in teaching the identity. If you're in spaces or schools that don't have that, what you have to do is be that voice. One of my mentees attended a very affluent private school, and he was one of very few Black students, and he lifted up his voice. He was a part of committees about racial change and justice. He called out white privilege. He called out prejudice. He called out it all. And that then led to increased participation in African-American programs and clubs that had not previously existed at that affluent white private school. And so it's just about finding your voice, lifting up your voice, having your white allies lift up their voices, us coming together to collaborate and hold each other accountable for what we need to be representative of our students. And I think the second part of your question is having those difficult conversations. You have to have conversations with your coworkers that allow them to examine their own bias and their own privilege, to throw away with the respectability politics, to really dig deep into the things that they carry, because we all come to work carrying something. And so when you talk to your white counterparts, they have to, one, be willing to do the work. It's not the responsibility of the Black educators to always answer all the Black questions in the room. It's not the responsibility of the Black educators to have the students who are the most behaviorally challenged. It's not the responsibility of the Black educators to deal with all of the problems that are associated with being Black, yet they get to reap all the benefits while being white.
Google is a thing.
To do allow them to independently and on their own accord unpack the things that they're carrying and become invested in being a true ally in our cause.
Yes, absolutely. Like everything that you said, I think this is a great time because everyone is coming out pro all things Blackness. And so like I told my colleagues, I was like, I see which one of y'all ain't never said anything about our cause. And now you guys are super on it. So please keep the same energy come September, come August. Because I'm going to be the person that's like, hey, well, remember when you had Black Lives Matter? This curriculum, what about this? So like when I'm ready to go talk to my principal about a curriculum that I believe is racist, who's standing with me? Who's doing, and exactly what Joseph said, like you as a white person, you need to be able to use your privilege and bend your privilege so that it does not fall on the backs of us. It's like, we got to go through the pain, we got to experience it all, then we got to teach other people how to go through it and how to, like, it's all too much. And so I would say that it is responsibility of admin and teachers to make sure that what we are doing in our school building is anti-racist, regardless of politics, regardless of money. And that's the real thing. Like, you have to be able to risk it all, because that's essentially what we're doing, especially when it comes to uplifting Blackness in America. You have to be willing to risk it all. And really, if I can be honest, as a Black educator, I shouldn't have to risk it. White educators should have to risk it all. And really, and that is when you get the buy-in. I asked the white educators of my school, I was like, When you're ready to risk it all, then you can come have a conversation about me, about what I'm experiencing. Because until then, until there's something that you have to give up, something that is going to cost you, you will not even understand a tiny glimpse of what I experience in this building day to day. And forget me, because I'm an adult, I'll be able to figure it out, hopefully. Our children, who maybe aren't as equipped as we are, who don't have all the words and vocabulary and support. So it's like, I do think that we are all going to have to get on one accord about what we're doing in our buildings for our students. And I say in our buildings, but y'all know I just mean as a school. And then for curriculum, I believe that if your curriculum is not anti-racist, throw it out. Throw it out. You need a curriculum that is going to serve your students so that they too can be emancipated from everything that we're experiencing. And I do think that's important. So resources or not, you have to do something different. You can't go into this school year doing the same things that we've done. And so, I mean, I love that you guys have an all Black staff. That's like heaven. I'm like, wow. And not that that necessarily means that it's going to completely be anti-racist.
I was just going to say,
y'all, there's a lot in there.
Yep.
it even just that image, right? For students to see people who look like them frequenting the building and in a position of power, like a teacher and things like that, and admin, that's important. And that's a start. And so then you start diving into the curriculum, you start diving into beliefs. But ultimately, we all have to do the self-work. And it's hard work, so it's going to take a long time to change, but that is the most important. And really, you know, I share this with my principal often, and I'm not admin, but I have ideas. And so I tell her, I'm like, it's either you get on this boat and you're doing this, or you got to go somewhere else, because our kids have been too harmed for you to come in and perpetuate that harm. Our kids' lives are at risk here, physically, emotionally, and mentally. And that, at the end of the day, is most important. So you're not doing what has to be done for them. Just do something else. So I guess the first step would be the self-work, what you're doing in yourself.
I guess in closing, you guys have said so many rich things. We've challenged the structure, the funding, how money is allocated. We've challenged curricula. We've talked about parents and the relationship between parents and students and educators and colleagues. But I want you all to speak to the ways that we can support. When Calvin and I first started this podcast, I envisioned this space to be cathartic, a place where Black people can come, talk about these issues, maybe publicize them, but it's a place that gives us voice. Calvin envisioned it to be a place where we're not only being cathartic, but we're also educating. But now we're noticing, and I'll speak to this, when we're about to conclude, we're in a space where we can not only be cathartic, educate, advise, but also agitate. Yeah. And speak to those who have power to change. So in what ways can those of us who are not in the education system, who don't work in the education realm, support you all in your anti-racist work?
I think that's a great question. I think that, the ways that you can support educators is by placing value on just that. There has been such a lack of value in this country about the work that educators do, particularly Black educators. So we need people to continually lift up our voices. We need people to continually advocate for us. We need people to continually advocate for resources. So even though you're not directly there, you can use your platform to speak out about the resources that schools need. You can use your platform to advocate for those laptops and devices, like Nadiera said, that every student deserves, the internet access that every student deserves. And so if we have more people just doing that, that's bringing more attention to our cause on the front lines. So that's one way you can definitely advocate and help educators with the work.
And I would add voting. You are a person who votes. And voting in the local elections are just as important as voting in the presidential election. So when we have people in office who don't care about education, who don't value education, that's where you come in. And that's where people who have never set foot in a school building, I don't know, that's weird to say, but who have never, who don't work in a school building, that's how you can advocate on our behalf. The other thing I would say, and this may be a little controversial, I would advocate keeping your children in public schools and being a part of the PTA or PTO, being involved in the school, because a lot of what happens is we have children who leave public schools, or they'll go for elementary and then go to a private school or to a charter school, and nothing, it's hard because you can get some really great mom and pop charter schools, and then there's like some corporate charter schools, so you have to decide. But I think the public schools is what gives power to the people. And so when that power is stripped, when people decide to leave and things like that, that power lessens. When people are not as involved, that power lessens. And so I do believe being involved in your local public school can help. Like, even if you go to volunteer, even if the two of you decide, I want to volunteer at a public school once a week or something, there are very small things that you can do that have huge impacts.
Right. And I think that from a student's perspective, most definitely students helping students out, and realizing that not only are educators, Black educators, not the Google to all the answers for racism and race, but also Black students should not have to be that same vessel for white students in the classroom, because I can only speak from the perspective of what I've endured and what I've gone through. But also students working with educators and educators working with students, trying to change the scenery of the classroom, because I think the classroom kind of replicates that of a jail cell in which we are stuck in these desks and looking at a board in front of us. But what about us going outside and really examining the world around us? I think that's something that would be interesting to see schools do.
To all y'all's point, I've made a statement that in 2019, I was done educating white folks about racism, about things related to Black people. When there's Google, when there's all of these other tools for you to do your own research. For me, and this is no different. For me, I'm not in the position where I want to repeatedly have to affirm my humanity to you. I don't want to repeatedly affirm that my Blackness has worth and that I'm being devalued. You talked about being empathetic, Nadiera, and I said that's a powerful point, because your empathy should kick in. Even if you don't understand, even if you don't agree, you should be empathetic,
right,
as one person to another about my experience as a Black man. And we need people who are empathetic about our Black children. And so I just wanted to thank Nadiera and Joseph for their work, for their centering Black identity, for their work dismantling white supremacy, for their boldness and not being afraid to confront white patriarchy, white supremacy, white privilege, wherever it is. And we thank y'all for taking time out of y'all busy schedules to come and talk to us tonight. Before we leave, Calvin and I have an announcement to make that we're very excited about. Speaking of all things Black and all things great, Colorcast Podcast and Network is a Black company that's working to increase the amount of people of color that are in the podcasting industry. And they are launching an inaugural class, if you will, of Black podcasters. And it was a series of competitions in phases. And Calvin and I are pleased to announce that we have made the second phase.
Yay.
Of that. And we are extremely, extremely, extremely excited about what that entails for this platform, for what that entails for Parkside as a church, for what that entails about these discussions moving forward. And so we thank all of you for your continued support each week. We couldn't do this without you all watching, you all participating, you all speaking and engaging with us.
And check our SoundCloud out. We recently created that as well. So if you missed some of the past segments that we've done, from COVID-19 to really looking at and examining the news, check that out. We'll make sure to link that as well. If you want to listen to some of our past ones, including the one that we just had today, which should be on there very soon.
Exactly. And since we're talking about voting, next week we will be discussing all things voting, since a primary is coming up here in New Jersey. and we're going to virtually show you all how to fill out your mail-in ballots. So please come back and be with us next week. But until then, this is Will and Calvin. We are two Black church boys, and we are out.
Stay tuned. Thank you.